The world remembers the victors, and the world remembers the monsters. But the world has forgotten the blood-soaked silence of April 1948. Close your eyes and imagine the stench of rotting dreams in the ruins of Germany. Imagine a woman, Anna Weber, kneeling in the dirt of a British-occupied cemetery, her fingers raw from pulling weeds off a grave that the rest of humanity wanted to erase from existence. For 3 years, every single Sunday, she made this pilgrimage to a wooden cross that marked the remains of her husband, Friedrich, a man labeled an enemy, a man killed by the very forces now patrolling her streets. But on this specific Sunday, the air felt different. An elderly woman, a shadow among the headstones, leaned in close, her breath cold against Anna's ear. "You think you're the only one who cares for this ghost?" she hissed. "You aren't. There is a man. A British man. He comes when the world is asleep. He stands where you stand, and he honors the man who died by his hand. Let that sink in. A British sergeant, a conqueror, standing over the soil of a German commander he was ordered to destroy. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the raw, shocking, and brutal reality of the aftermath of World War II. We are stripping back the propaganda to look at the visceral connection between two men who should have hated each other unto death, but instead found a bond in the graveyard of history. This is the story of the Wednesday Visitor, and it starts with a massacre. To understand the shock of that grave, you have to understand the violence of March 15th, 1945. The war was screaming toward its end, but the dying gasps of the Third Reich were the loudest. Friedrich Weber wasn't just a name or a cross. He was a stone wall. He commanded an infantry company near the Ilmanau River, tasked with a suicidal mission: hold back the British 7th Armored Division. These weren't just soldiers. They were the desert rats, battle-hardened, ruthless, and tired of burying their own. The British needed a breakthrough. The Germans needed a miracle. What followed was 6 hours of pure, unadulterated carnage. Artillery shells rained down like the wrath of God, turning the riverbank into a landscape of fire and steel. Friedrich Weber didn't run. He didn't hide in a trench. He stood in his command post, barking orders through the smoke, directing his men while the world collapsed around him. At 14:30 hours, a pinpoint artillery strike directed with surgical precision shattered his position. Friedrich Weber was erased in a flash of cordite. The man who called in that strike? Sergeant Thomas Wright. He was the eyes of the British artillery. He watched through his binoculars as the shells he ordered turned Friedrich's position into a crater. In the heat of battle, there is no room for remorse. There is only the objective. The British swept through, found Friedrich's broken body, and realized they hadn't just killed a target. They had killed a professional. Even in the hatred of 1945, the British Captain Morrison recognized the courage of the man they had just pulverized. Friedrich was buried with military honors, a rare gesture in the final chaotic weeks of a war that had seen every rule of humanity broken. Then came the silence. The war ended. The maps were redrawn. Germany was carved into zones of occupation. Anna Weber, only 24 years old and widowed by a telegram, lived in a world of starvation and rubble. To the British occupiers, she was just another face of the defeated. To her, the British were the monsters who turned her husband into dust. Every Sunday, she went to that cemetery in Lunderberg. She thought she was the guardian of Friedrich's memory. She thought her grief was a private fortress. She was wrong. When that elderly woman told her about the Wednesday visitor, Anna's world tilted. Anger, sharp and jagged, pierced through her mourning. Why would a Brit be there? Was he desecrating the grave? Was he gloating over his kill? The thought of a British boot stepping on the soil above Friedrich's head was an insult she couldn't endure. She didn't wait. She didn't pray. She planned. On Wednesday, April 14th, 1948, Anna Weber didn't go to the cemetery to mourn. She went to hunt. She arrived at 7 o'clock hours, crouching in the shadows of the perimeter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cemetery was a ghost town, the morning fog clinging to the crosses like a shroud. And then he appeared. He didn't come with a tank. He didn't come with a rifle. Thomas Wright, now a civilian contractor, but still carrying the rigid posture of a sergeant, walked through the gate. He was wearing drab civilian clothes, looking like any other man trying to survive the reconstruction. But in his hand, he held a small bundle of wildflowers. Anna watched, her breath hitching in her throat, as the man who represented the army that destroyed her life walked straight to Friedrich's grave. He didn't look around. He didn't hesitate. He knelt. For 10 minutes, the silence was absolute. Thomas Wright didn't move. He didn't perform a ritual. He simply existed in the space above the man he had killed. He placed the flowers down simple wild things and bowed his head. This wasn't the posture of a victor. This was the posture of a man haunted. Anna's rage began to dissolve into a terrifying confusion. This was the enemy. This was the man whose artillery fire had made her a widow. Yet here he was, honoring the dead in a way that defied every logic of the war. She couldn't stay hidden. As Thomas stood up to leave, Anna stepped out from the shadows. The confrontation was electric. The air between them was heavy with the weight of thousands of dead soldiers and the smoke of burnt cities. "Why?" she demanded, her voice cracking the morning stillness. "Why do you come to this grave? You are British. He was German. You killed him." Thomas Wright stopped. He didn't flinch. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much fire and too little peace. He didn't offer a hollow apology. He didn't make excuses. He spoke in halting, broken German, but the words hit like a hammer blow. "I was there," he said, "March 15th, the river. I saw him through my glass. I gave the order." The honesty was brutal. It was shocking. He wasn't hiding behind the just following orders mask. He was taking ownership of the blood. He told her how Friedrich had stayed at his post when others would have fled. He told her that in the moment of death, the uniforms didn't matter. What mattered was that a man of courage had been extinguished, and Thomas Wright couldn't let that fire go out completely. Thomas Wright stood there, not as a conqueror, but as a man stripped of his pride by the weight of the soil between them. The rhythm of the war had always been loud drums, whistles, the rhythmic thud of mortar, but this silence in the Lunderberg cemetery was deafening. Anna stared at him, her eyes searching for a flicker of malice, a hint of British arrogance, but she found only a hollow exhaustion. This was the man who had orchestrated the destruction of her world, and he was standing there with dirt on his knees from the very ground that held her husband's bones. "I visit because I remember," Wright whispered, his voice steady despite the tension. He didn't look away. He told her about the smoke of March 15th, how the Ilmanau River had turned black with oil and ash. He described the way Friedrich's company had fought, not like men seeking glory, but like men who had nowhere left to go. "We were told you were all monsters," Wright said, his German getting sharper as the emotion took hold. "But when the smoke cleared and I stood over his command post, I didn't see a monster. I saw a man who didn't abandon his post. I saw a soldier who did his duty until the universe itself stopped him. My Captain Morrison, he felt it too. That's why we gave him the honors. That's why we didn't just toss him into a pit." The shock of his words was like a second artillery strike. In the official history books, the Germans were the villains and the British were the liberators. But in the raw, bleeding dirt of a cemetery, those labels were a joke. Wright was admitting that the enemy he was trained to kill was someone he respected more than the politicians who sent him there. He was admitting that every Wednesday he left his British life behind to stand in the shadow of a man he had deleted from the earth. "You killed him," Anna repeated, her voice a jagged edge. "You took him from me, and now you bring him flowers? Do you think flowers fix a bullet? Do you think kneeling here makes your hands clean?" She wasn't looking for a peaceful resolution. She wanted him to feel the jagged shards of her broken life. She wanted him to realize that his respect was a luxury he could afford because he was still breathing, while Friedrich was feeding the grass. Wright didn't flinch. He took the verbal lashing like a soldier taking shrapnel. "Nothing makes my hands clean," he replied, his voice dropping to a low, aggressive rasp. "Don't come here for me. I come here because the world is moving on. The ruins are being cleared. The shops are reopening. People want to forget the blood. They want to forget that men like Friedrich existed. If I don't come, if I don't stand here, then his death was just a number on a logistics report. I refuse to let him be just a number. I am the man who killed him, which means I am the man who knows exactly what the world lost." This was the psychological war within the aftermath. For months, they began to meet on that same bench. A British sergeant and a German widow, a pairing that would have seen them both lynched if the wrong people had been watching. They didn't talk about peace or forgiveness. Those were soft words for people who hadn't seen the fire. They talked about the cold. They talked about the way the hunger in 1946 felt like a slow death. Wright told her about Yorkshire, about the wife he had back home, who didn't understand why he looked at the rain and saw the Ilmanau River. He told her about the desert rats and the guilt of being the one who survived when better men were buried in the mud. Anna listened, her hatred slowly calcifying into a grim, shared understanding. She told him about the letters Friedrich used to send letters that, started with hope in 1942 and ended with a haunting, final silence in 1945. She told him about the wedding dress she had to trade for a sack of potatoes. She stripped away the romanticism of the home front and showed him the ugly, starving reality of the defeated. And through it all, Wright sat there, taking it. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered witness. He was the only person in the world who understood the magnitude of what was buried in that grave, because he was the one who had put it there. The rhythm of their meetings became a ritual of penance. They were two ghosts haunting the same plot of land. Wright's presence was a constant reminder of her loss, but it was also the only thing that made Friedrich's death feel significant. In a Germany that was being rebuilt and forced to look forward, Wright was the only one willing to look back into the grave with her. But the clock was ticking. The British occupation wasn't a permanent state of being. The Control Commission was winding down its operations. The reconstruction projects Wright was supervising were nearing completion. The news came like a cold front. Wright was being sent back to England. His time in the ruins was over. The war was finally, truly ending for him. On his final Wednesday, in November 1948, the fog was so thick you couldn't see the gate from the grave. Wright was there, his coat collar turned up against the biting wind. He didn't have flowers this time. He had a camera, a small, heavy piece of equipment. He took a single photograph of the grave, the shutter click sounding like a rifle shot in the quiet cemetery. "I'm leaving," he said as Anna approached. "To your wife? To your carpentry shop?" Anna asked. There was no bitterness in her voice now, only a hollow dread. If he left, she would be alone with the silence again. The man who killed her husband was the only one left who truly remembered him. Wright nodded. "I'm going back to a world that doesn't want to hear about this. They want to hear about the victory. They want to hear about the parades. They don't want to hear about the German commander who stood his ground until the artillery tore him apart." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper with an address in Yorkshire. "I won't be here on Wednesdays anymore, but I won't stop." Anna looked at the address. It felt like a tether to a world that was moving too fast. "You'll be in England. You'll be safe. You'll forget," she challenged him one last time. Wright stepped closer, his eyes burning with a dark intensity. "Listen to me. Every Wednesday at 7:45, the exact time I used to arrive at this gate, I will stop. It doesn't matter if I'm at my bench or in the street. I will give him 2 minutes. 1 minute for the man he was, and 1 minute for the man I had to be to kill him. That is my promise. As long as I have breath, Friedrich Weber will have a witness in England." He turned and walked into the fog, his figure disappearing before he even reached the gate. He left Anna standing by the cross, holding the address of a man who should have been her mortal enemy, but had become the only person who kept her husband's soul from fading into the gray mist of history. The transition from occupation to memory had begun, and it was more violent than the war itself. The fog of 1948 didn't just swallow Thomas Wright. It swallowed the truth of what happened in that cemetery. Wright returned to Yorkshire, back to the smell of fresh sawdust and the quiet, rhythmic life of a carpenter. But he was a man living a double life. Every Wednesday morning, as the clock struck 7:45, the saws in his shop stopped. The hammers fell silent. His workers thought it was a strange quirk of a war-torn mind. But Wright was back in Lunderberg. For 2 minutes, he wasn't a British civilian. He was a soldier standing in spirit over the grave of Friedrich Weber. He kept that photograph, the one of the German grave, tucked inside his pocket. A jagged piece of shrapnel kept close to his heart. It was his penance and his pride. In Germany, Anna Weber became a shadow in a world trying to move too fast. The reconstruction turned the ruins into glass and concrete, and the world grew bored of the old war stories. People stopped talking about the dead. They wanted to talk about the future. But Anna never missed a Sunday. She watched as the British Guards were replaced by German administrators, and as the small, intimate military cemetery was consolidated into a massive, cold memorial. Friedrich's individual wooden cross was eventually gone, replaced by a name on a stone wall among thousands of others, but she knew exactly where the earth had once opened for him. She didn't need a marker. She had the memory of a British man kneeling in the fog to guide her eyes. The shock isn't that they stayed in touch. The shock is that they never had to. Their bond wasn't built on letters, phone calls, or the soft sentimentality of peace. It was built on a shared haunting. They were two sides of the same coin, tossed into the dirt by a war that didn't care if they lived or died. In 1967, Anna's strength finally failed. On her deathbed, she didn't ask for a priest or a prayer. She asked to be buried facing southeast directly toward the old military cemetery. She wanted her sightless eyes to forever guard the spot where the enemy had once knelt in respect. She died as she lived, a sentinel for a ghost. Then came 1972. Thomas Wright, an old man in a quiet English town, felt his own end approaching. He didn't ask for a grand funeral or a parade. His will contained one brutal, non-negotiable command that shocked his family. The photograph of the Lunderberg grave is to be buried with me. No exceptions. It goes where I go. When he died, that image, the evidence of his enemy's existence and his own act of defiance against hate, was placed in his cold hands. This is the ultimate betrayal of war's logic. Two nations fought to erase each other, yet two individuals spent their entire lives making sure the other side was never forgotten. Thomas Wright and Anna Weber proved that while generals plan the massacres, it's the survivors who decide who deserves to live forever. They died miles apart, separated by the sea and blood, but united by a secret.